All right, we are now live on YouTube. Hello, everybody. Happy New Year to everybody. Glad to see you at the very first contracts training of 2021. How's 2021 going so far? Boy, real humdinger compared to 2020. Man, life couldn't be better. So we're going to go through some contracts today. I'm your trusted broker, Bob. Well, I wouldn't say trusted, but a little bit. And we have Mark Miller with us too. Hi, Mark. How are you doing today? How is Arizona? Did you make it down to the border to check that wall to make sure it was still standing?
No.
No?
I
have a road trip?
I have people to do that.
You do? Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
It's 65 degrees here today, sunny, a little breezy.
I guess spring's already here. So much for winter. All right, so we're going to cover the buyer-broker agreement today, and we're going to talk about agency, and we're going to hopefully get you guys all geared up when you do your buyer consultations to actually get your buyers committed to working with you. So that brings up a good point about why you need to work with buyers that are committed to you, especially during this market right now we're in. In case you didn't know, we're in the midst of a pandemic. And just by going out your door, you're putting yourself in harm's way of coming in contact with the COVID virus. Now, some people believe it's a hoax. Some people believe it's real. Some people don't believe it at all. Whatever your personal opinion is, in our industry, we believe that it exists because that's mandated by the governor of the state of California, the Department of Public Health, as well as Cal-OSHA. So they put rules in place to follow. Hopefully you're all following the BPPP, the best business practices. What is it, Mark?
Protection plan.
Business practice protection plan. And part of that is to protect you, protect your clients, protect the buyers and sellers and everybody out there. So I will say this about working with buyers in this market. They need to be committed to you. And by being committed to you means they need to sign the buyer broker agreement because you're going out in a pandemic, putting yourself in harm's way to show them homes. So I think this is one of the best times now to get the buyer broker signed. I think it's kind of a no-brainer. Wouldn't you agree with that, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, the way I would position it is I'd say, look, I'm making a commitment to work with you, one-on-one and do things that other agents won't do for you, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. And when we talk about the addendum to the BRE, but basically, reinforce with the buyer that, you're going to go out of your way to find them a home and the things that you're going to do.
Mm-hmm. Even more so now. And I think, I feel the buyers will be more loyal to you and they'll be willing to say, oh yeah, I'll work with one agent and I'll work with you. So, God, we have a special guest here today, our very own Ed Belinke from Movement Mortgage. Why are you showing up? Oh, there, now he went and go hide. He's very shy today.
How's it going, everybody?
Good.
Did you read the headline about the Patriots coach? What's his name again?
Yeah, he said thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you. Next.
See, I think the reason Ed was here today is because he heard there was going to be cookies, but that wasn't that kind of cookie yet. It was a different kind of cookie.
I see. All right, I'll see you guys later.
If you guys don't know Ed, he's one of our preferred lenders here at the office with Movement Mortgage. You should get to know him.
And I love learning new stuff about contracts too.
It's just down your alley.
Yep.
I
read them every day.
Contracts is real riveting, let me tell you.
Well, I mean, it is, kind of appropriate that Ed's here too, because, one of the key points of having a BRE is that your buyer's pre-qualified before you take them and put them in your car or meet them at a property or however you decide to, navigate COVID. Having someone who's pre-approved before you ever even look at properties is really key.
Yeah, a lot of agents won't even let you in without a letter.
You have to have the pre-approval before you even move anything in today's market.
The logic behind that is it's just silly not to, because you know, how would you know what price point to shop in if you don't know if they're pre-qualified?
Agreed. Okay. All right, so let's get moving into this. I'm going to share my screen. I dropped in the chat box what I call it's the agency disclosure script. And if you want to pull that up, I'm actually going to share it on the screen. So we're going to go through this. And I got to set up all my chat bars, etc. So why do you want to have a buyer consultation before you even go out and show homes? Well, you really want to get that buyer firmly committed to working with you, first and foremost. That's why. And we do that by having a consultation. Back in the good old days where we could meet in person, we would actually sit together in a room. And I always wanted to go and have the buyers go through the MLS with me, because once we start looking at homes that are on the MLS and we can see pictures, we can actually get a feel for the buyer's likes and dislikes by just actually seeing their eyes light up or their body light up when they see a home that really excites them. And that's in the days that you would go through and actually be able to get a feel from that person's energy once you start going through the MLS. At least that's how I did my buyer consults. Because you as an agent are going to help them sift and sort through properties that they're going to want to go look at, and then ultimately make a purchase on one of those properties. And it's less about, you know, they want a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house, and it's more about, well, what that 3-bedroom, 2-bath house is going to do for them. Why have the 3 bedrooms? Why have the 2 baths? What's important to them about that? And I remember when I bought my second home here in San Diego in 1992 or 94, sorry, that home, I just saw the picture of it and I knew that was my home. All I did was have to see the picture. And back in those days, there wasn't the internet. This picture was actually on a flyer with, remember those cameras that you can take a photo and it would be an instant photo? That's actually, it was that photo pasted on a flyer. And most buyers are probably going to be the same thing about when they see a house or a townhome or a condo that they like. You're going to want to see what their eyes look like. They're going to know when they pull up to it whether or not they're going to energetically be attached to it. So when you sit down and have a conversation with them, though, and start doing a buyer consult, the very first thing you're going to do, and you are required by the real estate rules in the state of California, to present to them about what agency is. An agency basically qualifies or brings forth a fiduciary relationship between you and that buyer and or seller. And I have this script that I kind of use in my contract training, and it kind of works for me. So let me just read through it so you'll get what it says and what the flavor is, and then I'm going to role play it about how I would present it. So you sit down, you have the meeting, and before we begin our meeting, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, there's a form I need to present to you. And as a licensed realtor within the California Bureau of Real Estate, I'm required by law to disclose to you agency. It's only a disclosure and not any agreement that binds you to me. In California, we have agency. Agency is a relationship that creates a fiduciary duty owed by the agent, that's me, to you, the principal, that's you, within the course and scope of the agency and the authority granted by the principal. Agency is created, for example, when a listing agreement is signed, a buyer representation agreement is signed, or a lease is signed, to name a few. And it goes on and explains there's 2 types of agency, there's single, there's dual. So how would I present that? And why do you want to have this done at the very top of the meeting? So let me first explain how I would do it, or the script I would play. Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, I really appreciate you agreeing to meet with me today. Before we begin today's meeting, I'm actually required by the California Department of Real Estate to give a disclosure to you. And that disclosure is called agency disclosure. Again, it's not a contract. It doesn't bind you to me in any way, but it basically gives to you and gives you a disclosure about what agency is. And I'm going to go through it with you a little bit. And if you have any questions, great, but I need to present this to you and have you sign it. Again, it's not a contract. It's just a disclosure that you received it. And that's it. I'd leave it at that. If they have questions on it, majority of people don't. But if they do, we'll go through what the form means and go through that form. But that's kind of it. And why you want to do that at the top of the hour or the top of the meeting is because it gets them in the habit of actually signing stuff. And that's really what you want to do. By putting a pen to paper, and in this case, in a virtual world, it will be via DocuSign. Once they get in the habit of signing something, it sets forth in motion something within their brain that, oh, I'm signing stuff, so let's just continue signing more stuff. It just kind of sets the tone of the relationship, and it kind of energetically seals a little bit of the relationship to move forward, that they're going to commit to working with you. So when you get to the end of the conversation, the buyer consultation, and you have them sign the buyer broker agreement, then they will be much more ready to sign it because they already started signing documents at the beginning of the meeting. Okay. And by the way, how do we get them to sign the BRE? I'll discuss just a little bit of that. And then we launch Ignite next Tuesday. And in part of the sessions of Ignite, we actually go through the buyer consultation. And there's actually a system established for working with buyers during the buyer consultation that you follow. And if you follow this system, you'll actually get that buyer to agree to sign the buyer broker. If you don't follow the system, then you haven't done your work to get them to sign the buyer broker. People will sign something when they know what's in it for them. And they will sign something and create a partnership or a relationship with an agent when they know that agent can help them. And so you have to take them through what I call the 7 stages. First stage is setting the stage. That's basically the, getting to know each other, having some niceties. If it's in the office, you're giving them a tour of the office, you're getting them some coffee or water, etc. And you're just kind of like, exchanging a little bit of energy at that point. And then you go into a needs analysis where you're going to uncover exactly what it is they are looking for in a home. And then you need to make sure you share your value proposition. Your value proposition is what you bring to the table, how you're going to help them. And there are sections in Ignite that will help you uncover what your value proposition, and everybody's a little different. If you're a brand new agent and you feel like, well, I don't know what value I bring. Yes, you do bring value. You bring the value based upon your life experiences that you're bringing as an agent. And then you educate the buyer about the market. Every buyer thinks the market's a little different. They'll hear stuff based on national and local media. Believe it or not, we still have buyers that think they can make offers for $100,000 under asking price. Just happened the other day. And then setting service expectations, what you bring to the table, and then what they expect of you, but also what you expect of them. Example of that would be, when a property comes on the market that fits their criteria, you've got to go see it right away, because if they wait, it'll be gone in the next 12 hours. And then you're closing for the agreement. The agreement meaning, well, moving forward here, my expectation is, let's forge an agreement and work together utilizing the buyer broker agreement. And then, of course, establishing the next steps. Every time you end a meeting with whether it's a buyer or a seller, you always say, here's what's going to happen next. Here's what's going to happen next. So I'm not going to go over much more about the buyer consultation process because that's covered in Ignite, but I want to make sure you understand that when you get to that, and if you follow the buyer consultation process and follow those 7 steps, you will get the buyers to sign a buyer broker agreement. Okay. So you all have access to Zip Form Broker Edition. When you signed on with our office, Mark sent you a link for Zip Form Broker Edition. This is where we store and house all of our digital contracts. We run it through a separate program than Zip Forms. We use Zip Form Broker Edition that allows us to put templates together and also a few other things when working within the Zip Form platform. So think of it as Zip Forms, but it's our own special Zip Form library that allows us to have a little bit more control over the documents that were within Zip Forms. And what I've done is I've gone ahead and I've created a new buyer transaction. And when you go ahead and apply the templates for that buyer transaction, it will automatically bring in all the necessary forms to work with that buyer, including the agency disclosure, the buyer broker, the purchase agreement, etc. When you do set up that transaction for, and I've named this buyer, Billy Bob Buyer, think of the cover sheet, and you want to go fill out the cover sheet because the cover sheet is, think of it as a working document that once you start getting into escrow and start working with that buyer and looking at properties, but once you get into escrow, it's all the important information you're going to need for that buyer and or seller about all the parties that are a part of the transaction. So you're going to want to start filling out the buyer's current mailing address because you'll need stuff like that just in case they need to be mailed anything. And then once you start getting into escrow, you'll fill in the seller information on the cover sheet. And then you'll start filling in information on the property information on the fully executed offer. And then who's the escrow officer? Who are the brokers involved in the transaction? Who's the lender you're working with? And in this case, hopefully it is Movement Mortgage. Who's the appraiser? What title company was part of the agreement? What pest control? Who's the natural hazard company? So the NHD company. Who's the home warranty company? And if it's in a condo, who's the HOA? So think of this document, the transaction cover sheet, is something you're going to want to give to your transaction coordinator so that they have all the information necessary. Because once you open escrow, everybody's going to need to have everybody else's information. So that's why I always want to use this transaction cover sheet as a working document as you layer different levels of the transaction and start doing more with this buyer once you start getting into the escrow process. So any questions on that? And if you're asking me questions in the chat box, know that I cannot see them. So if it's an important question, you feel free to unmute yourself and then ask out loud. Or Mark, if you're covering the chat box, you can pipe in too as well. Is that okay?
Okay.
Broker Bob, I had a question in that when you start going through this information with your potential buyer, are you having them sign stuff one at a time, or are you doing the full presentation with them and then sending them the docs to all sign at once, as far as agency disclosure and all of that?
So good question. We're going to get into that when we get to the agency disclosure document, and we'll discuss when is the time that you need to have that signed.
Okay.
So save that question. Anything else?
Yeah, is there like is there such thing as like So like how you have all of these documents listed here, you have to go and pull all of them and put them there, right? There's not like just one thing we can click on and it has all the forms in it and just it'll list it for us automatically, or?
That's actually kind of the concept of broker edition, in that it allows us to create what is known as a global template. And we predefine what we want to have loaded into a new transaction, whether it's a listing or a purchase transaction, in that global template. So when you start a new transaction, that a template's automatically applied. So when you click on continue in that start process, it takes you to the dashboard. And then when you click on documents, this tab that's showing right now, then you'll see all these documents listed. And then you'll have to, we're talking about buyer representation agreements right now, but as you start to actually craft an offer for a buyer, you might have to add in some additional documents. We can't really preload everything, but we preload the core items that you're going to need to use.
All right, appreciate it.
So for today's, we're going to cover the agency disclosure and the buyer rep agreement. And of course, I cover the cover sheet as well too. And then the addendum that gets added to the buyer rep agreement that outlines the commission that will be paid and how it's defined. And it just kind of like and I can't, well, let me stop sharing my screen. If you can give me a thumbs up in your coaching program, if you're a new agent and you have a launch coach, you can hit the thumbs up button that your coach is actually having you do transactions, fake transactions, to practice using zip forms and practice writing offers. And if they're not, you should be asking them, I want to get into my zip form broker edition and I want to actually start writing offers. And you can just take stuff that's in the MLS and start pretending you're working with the buyer, because the last thing you want, and as a brand new agent, I appreciate that you guys have a lot of information that's thrown at you. However, it's also your responsibility to make sure you're prepared, that if you have a buyer that wants to go out and put an offer on a property, that you kind of know what the first few steps are, rather than calling your coach at the 12th hour on a Saturday night saying, I need to write an offer, I need your help, and then getting frustrated because you didn't do the things necessary to prepare yourself to write an offer. So be practicing your offer writing, and be prepared that you're going to be out there, but the coaches will always be there to help you. But I can't tell you how many times that I, as a launch coach, when I first started coaching, but also the other coaches, felt like an agent was mad at them because they weren't available Saturday night at midnight. So I'm putting the onus back on you guys to make sure you're prepared. For those of you that were in Boy Scouts or Brownies or Cub Scouts, you know what I'm talking about. Be prepared. All right. So let's get into the agency disclosure. And unfortunately, where is the darn thing, Mark?
Well, it's actually part of the BRE packet.
Oh, that's right. You know what? It's been so long since I've taught this darn class.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So some of the forms that you're going to work with in zip forms have multiple forms within one template, let's call it. And so this is one of those cases where you have 3 forms, I believe, within this one packet or this one template.
Thank you for reminding me, Mark.
Sure.
And Mark, I'm at the office and there's a construction worker outside. So at any time I might need to hand it over to you and put myself on mute so they can come in and do something in my office.
All right, no problem.
Okay. So can everybody see that? Is everybody able to read that? Okay. All right. So this is the disclosure regarding real estate agency relationship. Again, the script I gave you outlines how you present it. But if you look at the very top of it, it says, as required by civil code at the very top of the page. So again, you're required by law to disclose agency relationship. Now, the question is, when are you required to disclose it? Does anybody want to put, and I'm going to see if I can pull up the chat box. Does anybody want to put in the chat box what they think their answer is?
At the top of the hour, like you said, right before you start talking to them.
And who said that? Cal?
Cal
Yes, sir.
said that.
So Cal said right before you start talking to them. Okay. Anybody else? Don't be shy. I guess we got no more takers. All right. So Cal, you're right and you're wrong. Not wrong, but could be modified a little bit.
Okay.
So as the law is written is as soon as possible that you start having and sitting there talking about a relationship of buying and selling homes. So as soon as possible could be subjective in your conversation with them. Back in the old days when you can do open houses, it doesn't mean you had to do it right at the open house when you first met them and you set an appointment. But it's really as soon as possible that you can get the form signed. And there is discretion in it, but I want you guys just to get in the habit of every meeting that you have with a brand new person, not every time you meet with them, but a brand new person that you start talking about buying or selling a houses, and you might not have the form on you, but the next time, let's say you actually sit down at an open house and you start talking about what they're looking for, and you actually go through a presentation, but you don't have the form on you, you should get it to them as soon as possible. You could send it to them after the meeting. So just remember, it's really as soon as possible, and that could be subjective. Would you agree with that, Mark?
Yeah, yes, I do. And one of the, general, I guess, rules I was taught was as soon as the conversation with someone turns from more casual to more professional. So someone may say to you, how's the market? And you go, oh, great, and things are selling really good. But when they ask you that question, like, could you put a comp together for me to tell me what my home is worth? That's when it changes, and that's when this is appropriate to provide it.
And unfortunately, Mark, when do most people get them signed?
At the time the contract is signed.
Yeah.
Or the agreement.
Yeah. And I go back to when I talked about when they start having people sign stuff, it actually energetically and psychologically gets them in the habit of signing more stuff. I just think if you get it signed as soon as possible, you're going to have them a lot easier to sign the listing agreement, the buyer broker agreement, the purchase agreement. Okay.
Cal, did you have a question?
No, it's okay. I'm sorry, I hit the wrong button.
No problem.
All right. So what is agency? So at the very top, you'll see there's a checkbox, and you would only check that box if it's in connection with a transaction for a leasehold interest exceeding 1 year. Rarely would anybody check that box. And then it goes on to say, when you enter into discussion with a real estate agent regarding a real estate transaction, you should from the outset understand what type of agency relationship or representation you wish to have with the agent in the transaction. So let me read through that sentence again. When you enter into a discussion with a real estate agent regarding a real estate transaction, and this is basically speaking to the buyer, seller, etc., you should, from the outset, understand what type of agency relationship or representation you wish to have with the agent in that transaction. That's basically what the form says to the buyer, seller, or whatever, the buyer or seller. You need to understand what agency is and what relationship you want to have with that individual. And it's broken down into a few things. One of them would be a seller's agent. Seller's agent in the terms of someone listing a home for sale. So a seller's agent under a listing agreement with the seller acts. And I'm going to go through to the seller, a fiduciary duty of utmost care, integrity, honesty, and loyalty in dealings with the seller. So fiduciary duty. A fiduciary duty basically means above all others. Above all others. In other words, as a seller's agent, I'm going to put you, Mr. Seller, above everybody else. My interest, the buyer's interest, the buyer's agent's interest, everybody else. You are more important than anybody in this transaction. And I'll do that with utmost care, integrity, honesty, and loyalty in dealings with you. And to the buyer and the seller, you will have a diligent exercise of reasonable skill and care in performance of the agent's duties. So diligent exercise of reasonable skill and care. Reasonable skill and care basically means that the agent is not going to be an expert in something like law or accounting or construction or foundations or plumbing or heating or air. That's why it's described as a diligent exercise and of reasonable skill and care in performance of the agent's duties, not that they're an expert in construction. So as an agent gets in a lot of trouble when they think they're an expert in construction or zoning or something like that, because you'll get asked a lot of questions by buyers and or sellers, mostly buyers. Do you think we can add a third bedroom onto this house? Do you think we can add a granny flat? Do you think we can add another bathroom? Your answer should be, I really don't know. I'm not an expert in that area, but I can put you in contact with people that can actually answer that question. And then a duty of honest and fair dealing and good faith, meaning you'll be honest in all of your actions, you'll deal with them fairly, and you'll do it all in good faith. And then item C talks about a duty to disclose all facts known to the agent materially affecting the value or desirability of the property that are not known to or within the diligent attention and observation of the parties. And an agent is not obligated to reveal to either party any confidential information obtained from the other party that does not involve the affirmative duties set forth above. And Mark, you're always better with explanation on that one sentence. Can you explain that sentence better than I can? Because I know you can.
Are we talking about item C?
Item C, the last sentence.
So material facts, you have to ask yourself a question like, what would this be an issue that would cause a buyer to potentially not want to buy this property? And in answering that, you can say, determine if it's a material fact or not. There's a barking dog next door. Is that a material fact? Could be. It has, it's adjacent to overhead power lines. Is that a material fact? Probably. So it depends on the buyer, so to one buyer, it might be a non-issue. To another buyer, it might be. So you have to evaluate and help your seller evaluate these issues that are material facts that could affect the desirability.
Thank you, Mark. And then the next section goes into the buyer's agent's role in a transaction. And most of it is similar to the seller's agent. But the difference is in this is it represents what the buyer's agent's responsibility is, whereas above was the seller's agent's responsibility. And then the next part goes into the agent representing both seller and buyer. And an agent representing both seller and buyer basically says, can legally be the agent of both the seller and the buyer in a transaction, but only with the knowledge and consent of both the seller and buyers. Now, this is the section of the agency disclosure relationship that freaks brokers out in the state of California, because the most litigated cases in real estate transactions that end up in court involve what we call dual representation, where, in other words, the broker represents both the buyer and the seller. And an agent within that brokerage represents both the buyer and the seller. So understand this, because this is the main confusion where some agents are confused. Dual agency is not where the buyer is represented by Keller Williams Realty San Diego Metro and then Keller Williams La Mesa. That's not dual agency. That's a whole separate broker. Dual agency is where we have a listing in our listing inventory, and you have a buyer that is buying that listing. That's dual agency. There's also what we refer to as DASA, D-A-S-A, dual agency by a single agent. Now, we as a broker have set certain safeguards in place because we don't want to have the legal liability, or for a brand new agent to be representing both buyer and seller in a transaction. You as a buyer's agent, brand new agent, could go represent a buyer on one of our listings represented by another agent in our office. But we have very specific guidelines on a single agent representing both buyer and seller, only because, one, they're the most litigated cases. And as a brand new agent, you might not have the nuances and the understanding of grasping a transaction yet. So we want to get you there. So as a brand new agent, we do not allow a brand new agent to represent both buyer and seller. You have to kind of get some season under your belt before we allow you to do that. And if we do allow you to do it, we have very specific guidelines and rules, not rules, but procedures to follow to protect all parties, the buyer, the seller, you, the agent, and us, the brokerage. So if that does come into your domain to be able to do that, you need to seek guidance and speak to me and or Mark. So Mark's aware, but mostly me, because I have to approve it. But that's what that section basically covers right there. And the reason why you present dual agency is because you might have a buyer that says, no, I don't, or a seller that says, no, I don't want you representing me as well as a buyer. I want you to be vested with me. So that's why you should talk about the agency disclosure with all of your sellers and all of your buyers. Because the buyer's agent, as a buyer's agent or as a buyer, they might want you just to represent them. Maybe they don't want you doing dual agency. So it's a good idea for the fiduciary to have an understanding about what that means. Mark, any comments on that?
The only thing I would add is that, like, and some of you have heard this already because you've attended my portion of new agent orientation, where I say that dual agency by a single agent, to me, is a lot like one attorney representing both the plaintiff and the defendant. And you watch television shows and courtrooms, you never see that happen. And why? Because each one, the plaintiff and the defendant, want their own unique representation. And it's basically the same thing here, even though this is a legal practice in California.
Thanks, Mark. And then the next section spells out the seller's and the buyer's responsibility. So this is kind of saying to, hey, above is what we're responsible for doing. Now this is what you're responsible for doing. And it kind of spells out, it doesn't relieve the seller or buyer from responsibility to protect their own interest. it says that they should read all the agreements they're signing. And it says a real estate agent is a person qualified to advise about real estate. If legal or tax advice is desired, consult a competent professional. And if you're a buyer, you have a duty to exercise reasonable care to protect yourself, which includes facts about the property, the material facts that Mark was talking about, which are known to you or within diligent attention and observation. And both buyers and sellers should get tax advice from a competent professional. And throughout your property transaction, you may receive more than one disclosure form, depending on the number of agents assisting you in the transaction. So it's basically kind of like this whole section is basically spelling out what the seller or buyer is responsible for doing. It's not all just us agents. You have to do whatever you can to protect yourself. And at the bottom is where you will check the appropriate party. In this case, it's the buyer. And you'll see where it says agent here, but it's actually the real estate broker firm. So we got Keller Williams, San Diego Metro, and then our DRE number. And then you as the salesperson or broker associate goes in this section right here with your DRE number. All right, any questions on that? Going once, going twice. Good. Let's move into the BRE. Oh, it's in this form, sorry. And then Mark. Okay, got it. Okay, the buyer representation agreement exclusive. And you'll always notice on forms, it will have a revision date at the very top. This form is updated in 12/18. So it's exclusive. Item section 1 addresses who are the parties to the agreement. Well, it's Billy Bob Buyer and Keller Williams Realty San Diego Metro, not you as an individual, but the brokerage. The agreements, the listing agreements, the purchase agreements, and the BREs are always with the brokerage. So know that, not you, the brokerage. And then you'll put in the beginning date and an end date. So how long do you think you should do a BRE in today's market? And that's a subjective answer. You can do a BRE for a weekend because you can cover all the homes you show a buyer for that weekend. You could do it for a month, 2 months, 3 months, 6 months. The concept is every individual scenario could be different. Let's say you have a buyer consultation and the buyer likes you, but they're not quite sure if they're ready to commit. That's okay, Mr. Buyer. You know, you don't quite know how I work. I'm not sure how you're going to work. Why don't we do this? Why don't we just do it for a weekend? You know, of the 12 homes I'm going to go show you this weekend, I at least want to know that if you like any one of those homes, that I'll be paid on any one of those homes. You could do it for a weekend. Again, why do you think that they would not be ready to sign an exclusive with you longer than a weekend? I covered it earlier in the.
You have an established trust and a real connection.
Yes, exactly. Thank you, Mindy. It all comes down to them wanting to work with you when they see what value you bring to the table. So, you know, if they're not ready to sign, hey, I've done something in the buyer consultation process that I haven't shown my value. I haven't established the trust, and they're not quite ready to say yes. What do I need to go back into the buyer consultation process and revisit to help establish that trust? It might take you a couple consultations to get it signed, but know that, you know, each time you'll get better and better and better if you don't get it signed. But it has to have a beginning and end date. You just can't leave it open-ended. So in this case, we'll go ahead and do it till March 12th. That's a good amount of time to put them under exclusive in this market. And then if you need to extend it after March 12th, you can go ahead and modify the agreement with a modification of terms. Section 1A describes what property to be acquired. So in this scenario, we wrote San Diego County. Now, here's what I would also recommend you do in this market, because we're in a different market now, is depending on the buyer's price range or what they're looking for, you might want to include Riverside County, because here's why. We had an agent that took on a buyer that wanted a single family residential. And as they got into the relationship and started looking, the buyer decided that Riverside or Temecula, which is in a different county, was probably going to be the area that they're going to have to look in, because they were not finding what they wanted down here. And the buyers decided that the Temecula commute wasn't going to be that bad for them. Well, that opened up a can of worms, because then the buyer says, well, I don't want you representing me. And our buyer's agent worked a long time with these buyers here in San Diego, and they could still work with them in Riverside. So it just kind of protects you in case they want to go to Riverside. Again, have the conversation with that buyer first. And you'll say stuff like this, I'm going to conclude Riverside because I can help you up there as well. As long as they know in advance, then they probably won't have an issue with it. And then the price range in this market, I would always put in to be determined, only because the price ranges keep going up and up and up so quick, because inventory being at a bare minimum right now. So being determined could open up, if they're in the $500,000 range right now, but next week maybe they're in the 5 million because they won the lottery. Item 2 says the following specified properties only. Okay, let's say you have that buyer that doesn't want to, just wants to look at a specific house. Great. Let's do a buyer broker just for that one particular property. And you'll check item 2. And then item 3 is for the properties I'm going to show you this weekend. So all the 10 properties we're going to take you on the tour and show. I at least want to get guaranteed that I'll get paid on that if you decide to make an offer. Not all these boxes will be filled. You'll pick and choose whether it's 1, 2, or 3. Any questions on that?
So I'm sorry, I don't want to get off track, but I think at some point in time, I was prompted to apply for a super key. Was that something about Riverside County? If you went to go show something like that?
Yes, if you're going to show properties in Riverside, because that's a different MLS, you're a member of SDAR, SDMLS, which is the central lock. But in Riverside, they have a different lockbox system. So if you're going to show properties up in Riverside, good question, by the way, you have to be able to access those properties. You can see the properties through the CRMLS portal on the MLS system, but to get into them is a whole nother thing. You'll have to have a reciprocal relationship or contact the board up in whoever it is for Temecula and see about getting super lock access for the listings up there. Okay. Section 2 revisits agency relationships again. It also addresses that item 2A, unless the property is 5 or more residential dwelling units, buyer acknowledges receipt of the disclosure regarding real estate agency relationships. So let's talk about what you guys are licensed to do as residential real estate agents. You can sell any property in the state of California that are 4 units or less. That's considered residential dwelling units. If it's 5 or more, that becomes a commercial application. So if you have a property that has 5 units plus, or like maybe 16 units, that's a commercial deal. That has to be referred out to the commercial department. But item 2A basically confirms again the disclosure that you've given them to sign. And it goes and discusses item 2C1, the possible dual agency with the seller, which we reviewed. We talked about, you know, maybe the seller doesn't want you representing the buyer. But it discusses what the possible dual agency with the seller is, in that we might have that listing that's being represented by another agent within our office. And it sets forth all the duties and responsibilities and liabilities and the fiduciary responsibility for that possible dual agency with the seller by our company, you as the agent and the other agent that's the listing agent. And then item 2C, where it says or 2 single agency, applies only if this section covers if we're a broker's firm that only lists properties for sale, or a broker firm does not list property. You will rarely check those boxes because you won't ever check those boxes, actually, to be precise. We do more. We list and we represent buyers here at this office. In item 2D, other potential buyer understands that other potential buyers may, through broker, consider, make offers on, or acquire the same or similar properties as those buyers is seeking to acquire. So item D basically says, hey, we're disclosing to you that we might be representing other buyers within our own brokerage that will probably be looking at the same homes you are. So we're letting you know that now. And item E talks about that non-confidentiality of buyers. Buyer is advised that the seller or listing agent may disclose the existence, terms, or condition of the buyer's offers unless all parties and their agent have signed a written confidentiality agreement. Whether any such information is actually disclosed depends on many factors, such as current market conditions, the prevailing practice in the real estate community, the listing agent's marketing strategy, and the instructions of the seller. So this kind of covers that you're advising the buyer that the seller will allow us to give you information for you to win an offer. Let me just put it that way. You're in a competitive bid situation and you're letting that buyer know that the seller or the listing agent will let us know what you're competing against. Unless that seller says, no, I don't want you telling them. I want them to all submit the offers without knowledge of what everybody else is writing. Does that explain it well enough, Mark? I think Mark went to sleep. Or you're
sorry,
on
I was muted. I said, yeah, I think that covers it.
Yeah. And then F is the confirmation. Unless the property is 5 or more dwelling units, broker shall confirm agency relationship described above, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Section 3 talks about, great, how do we as a broker, or how does the broker get paid so the broker can pay you as the agent? Well, the way we have it set up in the templates that Mark has put together in Zip Form Broker Edition, we'll always have item 3.3 checked. And we put an addendum in the transaction, as we call it, and we've labeled it BRE-ADM1. And we'll cover why it's labeled that way when we get to it. Okay? So keep section 3.3 on the back of your minds right now. We'll get to that. Because that's going to define the payment that you as the agent will make should a transaction close. Item B talks about the compensation payments and credits. That basically said the buyer is responsible for payment of the compensation as outlined in this agreement. However, other than the buyer compensates broker for services covered by this agreement, that amount shall be credited toward buyer's obligation to pay the compensation. So basically, it's what B stands for is if someone in the cooperating broker is offering a commission and it's outlined in the MLS and it says it's going to pay 2.5, great. Then we're going to accept that as the compensation as a credit to what is outlined in the BRE. For the most part, we accept what's in the MLS and it's being offered. We rarely hold the buyer, and we'll go over that in the addendum. Item C addresses our right as a broker to the compensation that's outlined in this agreement. How do we get paid? Section 1 discovered, well, we're going to get paid during the period of the representation period. So we did it for a 2-month period or any extension thereof if we extended it. So let's say the 2 months were up and we decided that we'll go ahead and extend the buyer broker agreement to another month or another 2 months. When that buyer enters into an agreement to acquire property described in paragraph 1A. So in other words, let's say you enter into escrow on the first month, 29th day. We will be able to collect that compensation because it was during the representation period or any extension thereof. Section 2 addresses, let's say they enter into escrow on a property during the representation period after, and you showed it to them, but they did it after the representation period expired because it was a property you show them. This will also guarantee that the broker gets paid if you put in something like an extension period or a calendar days after the representation period expired. So let's say you did a 2-month agreement, it expires on the 2-month and 5th day, the buyer makes an offer on a property, you show them on the 1-month 20th day, trying to ace you out. Well, because we have this little extension period in here, we'll still get paid on that. But you have an obligation to get that compensation paid. You will need to provide to that buyer within 3 calendar days after the expiration of this agreement or any extension, a list of all those properties you showed that buyer in order for you to get paid on it. So it's important for you to keep track of all the homes that you showed your buyers during the course of your relationship. And then if the buyer broker agreement expires, you send that list to the buyer, send it through email to confirm it. And then if they try to go around you behind your back, then you'll have a case, we'll have a case to go after them for the commission. Item D talks about the timing of the compensation. In other words, when is it paid? Well, it's paid upon when a transaction is completed. If an escrow is used and it's paid through escrow. If the transaction is prevented because the buyer defaulted, and let's say a buyer defaults, meaning they didn't proceed with the transaction, they defaulted, they could legally be obligated to pay you the commission. Rarely have we gone after a buyer to pay us commission when they defaulted on an agreement. That's a case-by-case basis, but it could be done. Or if item D3, if the acquisition was prevented by a party to the transaction other than the buyer. Let's say the seller breached the agreement. And since the seller breached the agreement, the buyer decided to go after and sue the seller because they were able to claim financial hardship from that seller through that transaction. And then we would go and sue that seller, or the buyer would sue the seller, and we'd be able to claim a portion of that. Rarely, I've never done that as a broker, but this is in this document because obviously it needed to be put in there one time because the forms committee said this needs to be in here because this has happened before. Item E says the buyer irrevocably assigns to the broker the compensation provided in paragraph 3A. In other words, they just say, okay, irrevocably, we can't take it back. We can't revoke it. You're irrevocably assigning it to us. Item F describes who the buyer is. Well, it includes any person or entity other than the broker related to buyer or who in any manner acts on buyer's behalf to acquire property described in paragraph 1A. So this is in here for a reason that, let's say a buyer through the course of the transaction decides through that transaction that they want to put it into a trust. They control the trust, they want it in the trust, and they could do that. And they move it into the purchase agreement to have it in the name of the trust. Well, that buyer technically still, we can get the money because even though they moved it into a trust as the buyer, we would still be able to be paid through that trust. Or let's say in some cases, it says includes any person. Especially here in San Diego, this happens occasionally where a military person would give become an attorney. What's that, Mark?
Power of attorney.
Power of attorney, attorney in fact, or a power of attorney to act on the buyer's behalf because the buyer in the military is transferred or they had to go back on their ship, but they're in the middle of the transaction. So they'll give a power of attorney to a family member or friend. So that means why they wrote includes any person or entity. Item G basically outlines that the buyer hasn't entered into a buyer-broker agreement with another person unless it's here. And in that case, this section covers what that relationship would be with that previous brokerage that this buyer had a relationship with. So if you do, and so this brings up a point, if you have a buyer you're sitting down with, and this happens a lot in this market, in any market, a buyer will get frustrated with the relationship they're in if after a few months they're not getting their offers accepted or whatever reason, but they'll always blame the agent that they're working with. So they go down a path and start looking out to get help from other agents. And it just might happen to be you. Good thing to ask would be, have you been in a relationship with another agent and did you sign a buyer broker with them? And 9 times out of 10, they'll say, I don't know. I forget what I signed. I know we signed a lot of stuff. You would need to know what relationship that buyer has with that previous brokerage if they had a buyer broker agreement in place, because that buyer could be responsible for paying that brokerage fee to it, or the fee the compensation that's coming to that other broker. So you'll need to know that. And in some cases, you might need to see a copy of that buyer broker agreement to see how long it's in effect. However, this paragraph, you could actually exclude or include that broker here to say, hey, we know you owe this other broker money, so we'll put their name here. Item number 4 talks about internet advertising, blogs, social media. It basically is kind of, let me describe it this way. It's the broker's ability to say, hey, we're going to go show your homes and they're going to be on the internet. We don't have access to what you're going to be looking at. You're going to look at properties over the internet. We don't have any control on who will obtain access to those photos on the properties you're going to look at. So this is kind of like we're washing our hands of this to let you know that you can't come to us and say, we don't want people to see the houses we're looking at on the internet. We have no control over it because it's the internet. Item 5 and 6. Item 5 is the broker's authorizations and obligations. I won't go through this one by one, but here's what I'll say. So basically, if you were to put a job description together for an agent it would be this right here. This is what you would put on your resume. So this is basically what you now are saying as a broker and as an agent for that broker. These are the authorizations and obligations per this agreement that I will be doing. I will help you locate properties. I will assist you with the financing process. I will provide a list of professional vendors who perform services. I'll help order reports, schedule, attend meetings, appointments, provide guidance to help buyer with the acquisition. For transactions of which the broker is aware or not precluded from participating by buyer, I'll provide and review forms, help create a property contract, deliver, communicate to buyer any disclosures, facilitate the escrow process. This is basically your job duties and your resume materials. Okay, so that's what that paragraph spells out. And then item 6 addresses the scope of broker duty. In other words, the scope is what we really have authority to do, but limits us because if we don't understand it, we don't have the ability to do it. So like I said earlier, foundation work, plumbing, heating, air. We don't have the square footage, permitting process. We don't know it, but we'll help you make contact with the people that do know it. Again, we're only knowledgeable in the transaction process, but we don't know it all. This is kind of the thing that if we end up in mediation or in any litigation, that kind of helps protect us to some degree. Any questions on that one? Okay. Anything to add, Mark?
No, just understand that, you know, you're a real estate agent and not, you know, one of these other roles. And you don't have expertise in that area. You can't give advice on that subject.
A master of nothing.
The best agents know nothing. You know, you're not an expert in anything. When you start being an expert, pretending you're an expert, that's what gets you in trouble. Item 7 talks about buyer's obligations. This is the buyer's obligation. View and consider properties selected by the broker, negotiate in good faith, act in good faith to complete the property contract. Within 5 days of this agreement, buyer shall provide relevant personal financial information to broker to assure buyer's ability to acquire property described in paragraph 1. You know, it's all the stuff that the buyer's supposed to do and what their obligations are. So this is the buyer's resume or the buyer's job duties. Item C, which is in bold, buyer agrees to indemnify, defend, and hold broker harmless from all claims, disputes, litigation, judgments, costs, and attorney's fees arising from any incorrect information supplied by buyer or from any material issues that buyer fails to disclose in writing to broker, and pay for reports, inspections, and meetings arranged by brokers on buyer's behalf. So basically says you're going to hold us harmless if you mess up, Mr. Buyer, and you ended up in litigation from the seller because you breached the agreement. That's kind of what this says. But it also says you're going to pay for any reports like inspections and meetings that we help you arrange, such as the appraisal or inspection. Buyers also advised to read the attached buyer's inspections advisory. So we'll get to that. And item 8 is other terms. You'll see it's already checked. We have attached to this the buyer's inspection advisory, which we're going to get to next. Item 9 talks about attorney fees. Hey, if any of us end up litigating this agreement, we're each responsible for our own attorney fees. By the way, whoever prevails will have to pay the other person's attorney fees. Item 10, this is kind of boilerplate. This is the entire agreement. In other words, it basically says there's no other agreement in place. This is the only agreement. And if there is another agreement in place, this supersedes that agreement. And dispute resolution. Dispute resolution allows for us as the broker and the buyer, if we agree to want to go out and dispute this agreement, we agree to mediate it. Mediation is where two parties come together through a mediation service and agree to work out our differences rather than going through court. It's cheaper, less expensive, and easier for both parties. Because you don't really need an attorney to go to mediation. You should have one, but you wouldn't really need it. So most people will opt for mediation. And then the last section is, any questions on mediation? Okay. And then the last section basically outlines the signature lines for everybody to sign. So you'll have, and hopefully at that time, Billy Bob will have an address and a telephone number. But you'll want to input the email into anything, everybody's contact information. Once you fill it all out into the cover sheet, it automatically populates into every other form.
Hey, Robert, before you move on to that BIA, can I make a comment?
Yeah.
On that section C, advisory, the last item on that page, everyone, take note that that will never, ever happen. And the reason is that our brokerage can elect to not participate in arbitration, binding arbitration, and we have chosen not to do so. So you would never, ever use that ARB form to add arbitration to this agreement.
Will you explain the difference between mediation and arbitration?
Yeah, basically mediation is a dispute resolution forum where the mediator tries to get the parties to arrive at an equitable decision to solve the problem. Binding arbitration is just what it says. It's a third party. Each of the people that have a dispute go to this third party. They pay a fee, and they are required to abide by the decision of the arbitrator after facts are presented. The problem with binding arbitration is that the arbitrator can rule in a manner that is completely contrary to real estate law or standard of practice or something like that. And you have no appeal to say that that decision was flawed because of that. It's binding on the arbitrator's decision. So about 2 years ago, no, longer than that, it was made an option for brokers to participate in binding arbitration or not. And we chose to not do so, like 90% of the other brokers in the state. So again, you would never use this ARB form that this section C references to add arbitration to any agreement.
Thank you, Mark.
You're welcome.
Okay, and then attached to, it talked about the buyer's inspection advisory, where it's sets forth the duties responsible by the buyer. Here's what the buyer's inspection advisory, to me, is the most important part of the not only the purchase agreement, but the buyer broker agreement. It basically says to the buyer, hey, you're buying a house. And by the way, if you're buying a house, you should investigate what that house is like. You should look at the general condition of the property. You should look at the square footage. You should look and see if there's wood destroying pests, the soil, the water and utilities, environmental hazards, earthquakes, fire hazard, building permits, rental property. Basically says, if you're buying a house, you should know everything about that house. And you do that by investigating that house. You do it through a general property inspection. And by the way, that general property inspector might say, you should seek secondary inspection on the heating or the foundation or the roof, because the general inspector, like the agent, they're not knowledgeable in stuff like that. They want to put that onto an expert, which they say they aren't. So in these cases, if a general property inspector says, we recommend you get a secondary inspection on the foundation because we see this, then your job as an agent, your fiduciary duty is to guide them to say, this is what the report says. In fact, it says you should get a secondary inspection on the foundation because they recommend it because they noticed X, Y, Z. It's within your rights to get that inspection. You should push them into that area. And of course, you memorialize all this in an email after you have the conversation with them as well, too. So basically, the BRE says you're buying a house, inspect the sucker. That way you know what you're getting into. And then Mark, since you're more knowledgeable about this form than I am, to explain it. I know what it means, but I still haven't gotten in the habit of explaining it.
Well, basically, this form is a relatively new form. As you can see, it was released a year ago in December, and it advises the parties to the agreement that they have certain rights to have certain information withheld from, being public. And basically, it's an advisory, to the individuals and the parties in the agreement. So, if you, take the time to read through this, it tells you how one could elect to not have information disclosed, and so forth. So, if you read through it once, you'll probably get it.
Basically, it's an advisory. It doesn't obligate anybody to anything, but it talks about their consumer privacy, the California Consumer Privacy Act. Okay. Moving on. Now we're going to go into, remember we talked about this one section right here where we talked about the compensation to broker, where we did the BRE ADM 1. We're going to pull that up. Where we have preloaded the addendum for describing how the compensation will be paid. So what is an addendum? An addendum basically you add something to either a contract or another portion, another contract within. And the way we label addendums, you need to identify what's an addendum to. So it's an addendum to the BRE. That's why we've labeled it BRE-ADM 1, meaning it's the first addendum to the BRE. If we were to modify the addendum later time, then we would label it BRE-ADM 2, BRE-ADM 3. So very tragic, unprofessional mistake that a lot of agents do in transaction. They'll just label this number 1. Well, great. What's an addendum to? So it's easier from a tracking mechanism to make sure you know what you're labeling it for. And in this case, we're labeling it to the buyer rep agreement, the exclusive. And this address is in here, but it should come in as unknown at this point. Because remember in my cover sheet, I filled in an address. But in the cover sheet, you should have unknown at this point. So just look at Fairy Tale Lane as not being in there. Look at that as being unknown. And then all the property information as well too. And then it spells out Billy Bob Buyer. And same thing with seller, it should say unknown. All right, so as your agent, I will accept the following consideration in connection with our buyer rep agreement. Number 1, For properties listed on the MLS, I will accept the cooperating broker commission offered by the listing agent. So if the cooperating broker is offering 2%, 2.5%, 3%, 3.5%, that's what I'll accept. Item 2, for properties offered for sale by owner or not otherwise listed, I will negotiate a commission with the seller to be paid out of seller funds at close of escrow. So this is important for you to know in this market, in a challenged inventory market. There are a few people that think they can sell their home themselves and save commission. And those are what we call for sale by owners. However, once a for sale by owner puts their home on the market, they easily discover that selling their home themselves is not all that great because the only body calling them are agents. And sometimes investors, and investors want a good deal. So they're not going to pay for it, or maybe an unqualified buyer. But this spells out that you as an agent will go look for sale by owners as well too, and I'll negotiate with that for sale by owner the purchase of that house. Now that's not a dual agency situation where you're representing both buyer and seller, because the way we're going to have you write the purchase agreement is you're only going to represent the buyer, and we'll have the seller sign a seller non-agency agreement. So if that happens, reach out to me or Mark, and we'll guide you through on how to do all that.
Can I add something here, Robert?
Yes.
So can anyone that's on the class today tell me what a value add proposition is? What you think it might mean? Added value proposition?
Well, our added value is that we can, because we're such a large brokerage, we have people already looking and most likely have people that would be interested in a property if I were to list it for them. So
Well,
that's an added value.
It's a great point, Mindy. It wasn't exactly where I was headed with my thought, but that's a great point in terms of, and you could use that to explain to a buyer when you're asking them to sign a buyer representation agreement, that fact that you just stated. That's a good point. But my point in bringing up value added proposition, when you're having this conversation with a buyer, would you please sign this BRE? Number 2 here is a key point as to why they should be working with you versus some other buyer, or excuse me, some other agent, because this is an item where you're going to go out of your way to not just look in the MLS and send them listings and that are, might fit. You're going to work to find them a property that might not even be on the market right now. And that's the added value, the added service that you're bringing or that they're receiving when they work with you exclusively. So keep that in mind and bring this point out that I'm going to do this for you, over and above what the next agent's going to do for you.
Good point, and that's a good way to get the buyer broker signed.
Right.
Because that's the added value you're bringing. Cal raised his hand.
I did. It wasn't a mistake, and you guys might have said it. I'm sorry if you did. On
If you
number,
did, sorry,
on-
you can't.
I think you've just given us a high five.
yeah. On line 3.
Haven't got there yet.
Oh, okay. All right.
We're going to do that one next.
I have a question. This is Kelly.
Hi, Kelly.
Hi. So on the buyer broker agreement, if we're able to negotiate what the buyers are paying the TC fee, where would you indicate that on the contract, on the buyer broker agreement?
So I think if I understand your question, it's that part of the agreement that an agent can have with the buyer is to pay for the services of a transaction coordinator. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. So this is one of the few documents that you can use to memorialize that.
Mhm.
And, you could add that as item 5 in, this section. You could say the buyer agrees to pay X, whatever that amount is,
Mhm.
for a transaction coordinator. Another place you could put it is in the BRE, but the BRE, that template doesn't work real well, because in that section 3, it wants you to pick only one box. And if you pick one box that says refer to BRE ADM1 attached, then you can't use any of the other sections. So adding it in this addendum as an item 5 to make the agreement with the buyer to pay that fee would be the place to do it.
Can you indicate that under 3B?
Yes, you could, but then it would remove the reference to BRE ADM1. It's just that the BRE form template unfortunately only lets you pick one, make one selection in that place, that section. So we'll see that here in a moment. So if we check number, let's say 3A2 to do that, to add 495 or whatever the number is, it will deselect 3A3.
Right.
So it's probably better to add it in the ADM1.
Okay, so that would be cleaner.
Now, just as a side note, I mentioned that this is one of the few places where you can do that. You cannot put a transaction coordinator fee in a purchase contract.
Of course.
Yeah,
Right.
so for everyone knows, I know that you know that, but not everyone does. And that's because NAR does not allow us to do that under standard of practice.
Okay. So in to avoid that, so on the addendum 1, the BRE addendum number 1, instead of saying, can you indicate, instead of saying transaction coordinating fee, can you put commission?
It could be listed as just as a buyer agrees to pay, whatever the amount is. And you could leave out the transaction coordinator fee word, or you could, say that it's in, additional commission. The reason that we're slicing hairs here on this is because adding fees to transactions can be a RESPA violation, but this particular issue hasn't gone to court yet, so you don't want to be the poster child for it. So the better way to do it would be to just say buyer agrees to pay, in addition, buyer agrees to pay, $495 or whatever the number is.
I see.
And, you could, in this case, like I said, it could say transaction coordinator fee, but the safest thing is if it doesn't say that. It just says that the buyer agrees to pay this. And maybe, Robert and I will work on some type of a clause to add here in item 5.
Well, I showed you what to put in item number 1. So
Yeah,
you would say plus $450.
yeah.
If that's, yeah, it's best not to label the transaction coordination fee. So you'd have to do an item number 1. You'd have to do an item number 2. You wouldn't do it in 3 because that's new homes. Well, we'll talk about that.
Okay.
So let's go into 3. For properties offered for sale by developers or builders, you agree to permit me to accompany you on any visit to a new home sale office to register as your representative. So this is really important. In our limited inventory we have, a lot of your buyers will start looking, and in the MLS, not all the new homes that are in San Diego will be in the MLS unless you are looking in the resources tab under the new construction in the MLS. So be aware, there are new homes for sale in San Diego. They're not in your search feed if you're not looking in the right section of the MLS. And here's also what happens is every builder developer, if they offer a cooperating broker compensation, they require you to be with that buyer at their very first visit to register them. So in your consultation with your buyer, here's the conversation that I always had with buyers. Mr. Buyer, here's about 50 of my business cards, and I'm giving them to you for this reason. I know there's sometimes I might not be with you. You might be out looking at open houses. You might stumble upon a new home development project. So if you go into a house that's an open house that has another agent there, I want you to give them one of my cards to say, here's my agent that's represented me, my exclusive agent that's represented me under a buyer broker agreement if you want to reach out to them.
Yeah,
One, it's putting that agent sitting in that open house that when they used to do open houses on notice, back off. Don't try and steal my buyer.
that will work for for a resale property, but it won't work for a new home developer.
Right.
The agent has to personally accompany the buyers to that on the very first visit. And so here's another strategy you can use, buyers agents. You know, you ask your buyer, are you interested in new homes in this area? And if they say yes, we'd like to look at new homes, you go into every new home development that they have an interest in, and you get them registered on all of those before you go to the resale market. And if they don't pull the trigger on one of those new homes, then you go to the resale market.
Good point. So this is in here for that reason, as a flag to remind them. But also remember, your buyers, when they want to buy, they're pretty excited about buying. And for whatever reason, sometimes they're just out and they're driving by, they see an open house and they forget that you want them to be protected, and they'll see these open houses without you, and you just have to protect your buyer, but you're also protecting you, that buyer stays with you. But it also puts them on notice for new homes development that says, I need to be with you. So let's go out and look at all the new homes you want, and we'll register you. Okay. And then on new homes, primarily about maybe 80–90% of the time, the builder has their own contract that you don't have to write a contract, and it's considered a referral. However, some builders will have it where you are actually solidified through agency as the buyer's representative. So you need to know the difference in the contract that what you sign. Are you just signing a registration card, or are they actually making you sign a contract? If they make you sign a contract for that buyer, then you are responsible for the storage requirements as set forth in the law to keep a copy of that contract here with our office. So that does go through the compliance process. We have a reduced amount to pay on that to go through the compliance process, but it has to be stored. We have to store it. And then item 4 talks about, here it is in a nutshell, if the buyer messes up and violates the term of the agreement, they're going to owe you 3% of the purchase price of what they buy. But this is where the sticking point is, that the buyer might ask, well, what does this mean? Well, for any property acquired in the term of this agreement where you acted in violation of our agency agreement, you agree to pay the commission otherwise offered through the MLS or an amount equivalent to 3% of the selling price for properties not listed in the MLS. So it basically says, if you go out and we're under an exclusive and you buy a property and you don't use me, we'll have the ability to recoup that commission that would have been due us, and we'll hold you to it. So that's probably going to be the most sticking point for most buyers to sign, but that's what contracts are. If they violate the term of the agreement, it shows who the responsible party and what they're going to be responsible for. So any questions on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty easy for a buyer to not violate the agreement if you've explained it well to them. The worst thing that they can do is to walk into an open house and let the listing agent there write an offer for them, which is, we talked about that. That's why you give them your business cards.
Please use that as a tactic, because they need to understand that you are there to help them in that relationship. But there are unscrupulous agents out there that will attempt to steal your client.
Absolutely. And sometimes, is Ed still on the call? Sometimes lenders. Not saying that Ed would do that.
Yeah.
I have a question. This is Monty.
Hey, Monty.
So the first, for properties listed on the MLS, I will accept a cooperation broker commission. Is there any way that buyer's agents can insure, or is this going to be covered in another contract class that the commission will be, if we can ensure that the commission is not the what's on the MLS? For example, if it's under 2.5%.
So in other words, if the cooperating broker is only offering 1%, but you want to make sure you're making 2.5 or 3.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, you can make up that deficit in the, you can modify that one sentence there to say, we'll accept what's being offered at a minimum of 2.5%.
Okay, good to know.
And there, that brings up another point too, is that there's another form called cooperating broker compensation, CBC. And you can use that form in any purchase agreement transaction. You just don't reference it in the section 5 or section 6, like I'm adding an addendum and it's called CBC. Don't do that. But you can use the CBC in any transaction. And here's my example. Let's say it says that the cooperating broker commissions 2.75 in the MLS, and you submit your offer, and then the listing agent changes it to 2.25 afterwards. Well, what proof do you have that it was 2.75? You really don't, so you could, use that CBC form and confirm the commission that's stated in the MLS. There's a section on there, you check a box, says I'm confirming what is in the MLS. Today, as I read the MLS, it says 2.75, that's what I'm confirming. But again, you can use that form, but you don't reference it in the purchase agreement.
So I guess
Where would you reference it then?
You don't reference it, you just send it along with the offer.
So what about if the home was a for sale by owner?
Mm-hmm.
That's where you would submit that form, so you can indicate.
And the seller would be paying the commission?
Correct.
Yeah, okay, then there's a separate form for that. It's called single party compensation agreement. The CBC, if you think about it, the title of it is Cooperating Broker Compensation Agreement. So it would be used by 2 brokers. If you have an unrepresented seller, you would use a single party compensation agreement to engage that seller, or make that seller commit to pay a certain amount for you bringing a buyer to them.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
If in the MLS, if that's ever some type of discrepancy, as far as the CBD, the percentage is being paid out, what would be more so appropriate to have that conversation? I mean, call him and say, look like you typed 1, then he says, well, I meant 3. Just go ahead and send that for him.
So good question. So
it's a good question. Yeah, Robert, go ahead.
Every property you show a buyer, you should print out the agent copy of that and what it clarifies in the MLS, because that has happened where an agent will go change the commission after they've put a home on the market and they see, oh, there's all these people that want this property. Let's take it from 3 to 2% or 2.5 to 1% or 1.5. So getting your printout of what is being offered on the data show will protect you. Then if there's a where you need to go and fight it with the board, then we can go after that through an arbitration hearing.
You could even take that agent report and attach it to the CBC document or form that you're sending, that you're using to confirm the commission, saying, look, here's what I printed out. This is what it says. I just want to make sure we're in agreement.
Okay, thank you.
Good question, Cal. I would definitely be doing that in this market because I've seen a lot more of listing agents changing compensation midstream, and it's creating havoc at the grievance committee and pro standards to follow up on stuff like that.
Thank you.
All right, any other questions, you guys? All right, so Thursday, we're gonna go over I believe it's the listing agreement. And all the supporting documents you'll need to open up a listing. And I didn't put into the chat box the list of the opening documents for transactions.
You're doing that now?
Do you have it in a PDF, Mark? Actually, well, let me show them where it's at. Because they need to know where that is. That's the best way for them to look at, because we do changes from time to time. So I am going to drop a link that you all should be aware of, in case if you're not. But this is our Google Drive that stores the most important documents that you guys need to have access to or should have access to. And I'll share the screen.
And you can bookmark that in your browser so that you can go back to it from time to time.
Definitely bookmark it. But in the KW Metro Associate folder, Mark has created the transaction opening documents for what is required to open a transaction, whether it's a buy side or a sell side, and everything you'll need just to open. Now, we don't have a checklist of every document needed for the transaction because every transaction requires different documents. So it doesn't make sense to make a document with a checklist of everything because there's no one size fits all. But these are the required to open when you open a buy side and a sell side in, and everything is stored in the Google folder called KW Metro Associate folder. I put that in the chat box. You should bookmark it.
And we'll go into more detail in the listing section or listing agreements training and in the purchase agreement training as to, you know, the nuances and the reasons why for those initial documents.
So here's your guys' homework tonight. Go into your Zip Form Broker Edition and fill out a buyer broker agreement. And use this as a reference to go through it if you don't remember. It's okay. And if you're in the launch program, submit it to your coach. If you're on a team, submit it to your team leader. Did I do this right? And hopefully the team leader knows the answer to the question. All right, guys. Great spending time.
Everyone.
Everybody have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Broker Bob. Thank you, Mark.
Bye.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a
Thank
lot.
you.
You.
Goodbye.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
I tried making that sugar thing that I saw on TikTok.